We're now joined by Dan Verdun, and I'm going to say Verdun because Dave Kidwell all the time, for the longest time I called you Verdun, and every time Dave Kidwell corrected me, and you've known Dan a long time, so I don't take that wrong from Dave. But the reason we're here talking to you, Dan, is you just came out with a book on Eastern Illinois football history, and I know Dave was a big part of that in terms of helping you dig up a lot of the nuggets about EIU football.
Dave was a big help, so were you, Rich, Sandy King, lots and lots of people. The book, as you mentioned, tells the whole history of Eastern football going all the way back to 1899, and I think there's a little something for everybody in there.
Now, you've kind of, when you do one of these books, you go through, and people know the modern history. I think a lot of times I'm kind of a history buff guy, and you may be as well since you're writing these books. I guess, what are some of the things that you learned about EIU football that, even as an alumnus of the program, you maybe weren't aware of?
Well, it's interesting. Most people think, Eastern's been one of the powers, in FCS and back in Division II days. But when I talked to Jim Edgar, who, grew up here in Charleston, he said, they were just awful. I think from 1951 up until the national championship season of '78, I think they had 3 winning seasons. And I think the last one prior to '78 was like 1961. So that was kind of a shocker for, I think, myself and a lot of other people.
Now, the rags to riches story, most people are familiar with. They're the 1977 team, 1-10, come back 1978. They always talk about the fact that the program might have been dropped, that they weren't successful, and Daryl Mudra comes in. Were you able to talk to, I'm assuming you talked to a few guys from that team, maybe even Coach Mudra. What did they tell you? What was kind of the mindset as to what helped turn the program that year?
I did talk to quite a few players. I talked to John Tierlink, who was an assistant coach, and of course Coach Mudra. And nearly all of them said from day one, Mudra came in and said, we're going to win a national championship. And the assistant coaches, Mike Shanahan and John Tierlink, really set the tone and got the players to believe. And it was basically the same players that had been through that one win season.
Now, you also, before that, you talked about Eastern's history hadn't been great. They had been to one bowl game. They went to the Corn Bowl, which used to be played up in Bloomington Normal, Decatur area. And I'm assuming you talked to some guys from that, because that would have been the one bright spot before '78.
I did. I was able to talk to Lou Stivers, who actually still lives here in Charleston. Lou was, of course, they played both ways back then. He was the center and also played linebacker, and he was team captain. And, he's sharp as a tack. He's in his 80s now. There was a reunion a few years ago for some of those fellas. As he mentioned, a lot of them are passing on. So it was a great opportunity to talk to Lou.
Now, one of the other people that's in the book, he wrote a foreword for you, is Bob Spoo, longtime coach here. You guys had a book signing a couple weeks ago at the first game against SIU. He was one of the people that came out and signed the book for you. I'm sure he had, I wouldn't say nuggets for him, but he probably had a lot of information, but he's probably the hardest guy in the world to get you to share information.
He is. And what you do in those situations, I'm sure you're well aware of, Rich, is if Coach Spoo won't talk about himself, you go out and you talk to people about him. So I talked to former players, I talked to people from administration, I talked to a lot of opposing coaches, and to a man, they all said, one of the most honest people they'd ever met. I heard some really good stories from some people who recruited against him that said, he was always above board.
Now, the other thing, and kind of because books take longer than I think people would realize to put together, you actually were able to come to a high point. I know we had originally kind of started doing this. It was Coach Spoo's last year, which wasn't a great year. There were some highlights, but not a lot. But you came in and were able to get Dino Babers 2 years, and I know Jimmy Garoppolo and Eric Laura are in the book as well. And even I looked at it the other day. Kim Dameron got 1 page in there because of the press date actually worked out. But it had to be exciting when you're trying to put a book out to be able to kind of bookend that with a highlight season like last year.
It was so exciting, and it kept pushing things back, as you said, but I'll push it back anytime for a reason like that. I mean, last year was arguably one of the greatest seasons in Eastern history. And the way the book ends is I took a computer simulation of all the great teams in Eastern history and played them out in a tournament, and you have to get the book to find out who won.
Now, you were able to talk to some of those people we talked about. You talked to Jimmy Garoppolo, you talked to Sean Payton. Those are charismatic guys, and so they probably have some information in that book that people aren't even aware of, and maybe shared some things with you that maybe the general public doesn't know about, some rituals or some funny things that happen in EIU football.
Yeah, there were some interesting things. Like, for example, Garoppolo came here, he was number 15. He had been number 10 all his life, from the time of a little kid. So going in his junior year, the opportunity came open for him to get number 10 back, and that was one of the things he wanted to do. Sean, of course, played here when I was a student here, when I worked for the Eastern News. So it was interesting to catch up with him.
Appreciate Dan. He'll be back at homecoming, and he'll be signing more copies of the book along with Coach Spoo, and I think Tim Carver's also going to be here that weekend as well. So more information is available at the EIU bookstore.